but we're going to move into our first panel discussion, which is about policies designed to strike that balance between protection of the environment, not just climate related, we can talk about other things as well, but also the promotion and the enhancement of economic prosperity. How do we strike that balance? And we have four wonderful people to have that discussion with. So as I introduce you, please walk up and grab one of the seats that isn't the center seat. The first person we have is Jean Charest. He's currently a partner at McCarthy Tetrault. He was Premier of Quebec for many years. He was also, back in the early 1990s, the Federal Minister of the Environment who took Canada to the first Rio Summit. So he's got a little bit of track record on the environment. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Steve Williams, President and CEO of a little company called Suncor Energy. He was on the stage when the Alberta government announced its climate policy back in 2015. So somebody might want to ask him about that. Striking the balance between the environment and the economy. Ed Whittingham, former executive director of the Pembina Institute and a long-time environmental thinker and doer. And Jennifer Winter, who's the scientific director of the Energy and Environment Policy Group at the University of Calgary School of Public Policy. Jen Winter. So, here we are. So hopefully everybody's mics work. We've actually got a fair amount of time. We've got roughly 60 minutes to talk, but then we've also got about 30 minutes, maybe a little bit less, for questions from the audience. But I'm actually going to suggest that we alter the format a little bit to get the audience a little bit more engaged. So here is my proposal. I'm going to ask you all a question. And the question is, as you see policies, you think about policies designed to strike that balance between environmental protection and maintaining and promoting economic prosperity, what for you is the biggest challenge or the biggest issue, biggest obstacle, if you like? And I'm going to ask everybody for a quick answer on that. And we'll get a sense of where everybody's coming from, and then we're just going to see where that conversation goes. But at about the 15-minute mark, I am going to actually ask for a couple of questions from the audience. So you know where the microphones are, so think about what question you might want to ask in about 15 minutes. We'll take a couple of questions. We'll then kind of process those and fuel them, use those to fuel our discussion, and then 15 minutes later, we'll do that again, and we'll proceed that way. Okay? So, that's the question. When you see policies, think about policies to strike that balance between the economy and the environment, what is the biggest challenge or issue for you? And I'm going to start at my far right, Jen Winter.
Okay, so I think the way I approach this is like any policy issue, healthcare, social spending, spending on education, it's a values-based discussion. And when climate changes and carbon pricing and emissions policy is a little more complex in many ways because it's a global problem. But at the end of the day, it is a values-based discussion. And so that means that we are going to disagree about how much to do, whether or not we should do anything, and how, if we're going to do anything, how we should do it. I mean, like, there's a lot of tension between, say, demand side versus supply side government intervention. And again, that's all around the values that any individual has when they're thinking about this policy area.
So we're going to come back, I think, to the demand side versus supply side. This is something that David Dodge was certainly talking about, and it's something that I think probably needs to be talked about more in this discussion. Let me go to the other side. Jean Charest, what's the biggest issue, challenge for you?
And thank you, Chris, for the invitation, ladies and gentlemen. I may probably state the obvious. I mean, it's aligning good policy with public opinion and how you make that happen. And that is dictated in good part, as we can witness right now as we speak, with an election campaign in Ontario, and there'll be an election campaign in Alberta, with circumstances that will, bring you in different directions. So in a lot of cases, policymakers, and David Dodge, your presentation speaks to that, probably have a pretty good idea of what good policy should be. But how do you implement that and make it happen, align it with public opinion? And then the second part of that is, how do you bring people to the table in a polarized environment, which I think is one of the things that most of us should worry about today in what we're witnessing on the pipeline debate and on the broader energy debate, is this polarization is making it extremely difficult for us to have that discussion among those who are interested in the policy outcome and the decisions we should be making. That's the very short-term challenge I see. And we can talk a bit later about these issues, because I think there's a story to tell, but in this environment it seems difficult to tell that story if a high number of people who are involved in the debate are not listening to what the other side has to say.
So communicating and listening in a polarized environment, I have a feeling we're going to come back to that one.
Yeah,
Ed?
Sure, and I'd like to pick up on what Jean was saying. You talked about a polarized environment. I think I'm a veteran of a hyper-polarized environment, and the debate that has happened in this province, in this country, internationally on oil sands and pipelines. And it's difficult. It's difficult to get anything done when you can't create some sort of safe middle ground for a politician like you were, Jean, to come out with good, sensible, coherent policy. Now, we were able to buck that trend. I had the pleasure of working with Steve over a prolonged period with a group of, I'd say, thoughtful CEOs, and I hope equally thoughtful executive directors of environmental groups, who really, really concertedly tried to build out that middle ground and create that safe space. And so, yes, Steve was on the stage behind the Premier, Rachel Notley, in November 2015, as I was, as were other executive directors, other CEOs, Chief Tony Alexis, and we created a good consensus. To your point about obstacles, I'm worried that consensus, perhaps that safe middle ground, is being eroded, and if you're a politician, it must feel like you're Han, Leia, and Luke in the trash compactor of the Death Star as the walls are so being pushed in. And at a time right now...
Do you have another analogy than that?
I'm sure you lived it. Yeah. And then we can think of the monster. It comes and sucks people. Anyways, not too many metaphors. And this is at a time when platforms are being written now for elections next year. And we're at risk of having that middle ground, unfortunately, eroded.
Consensus being eroded, and who is Darth Vader in the picture? We will come back to both of those. Steve Williams.
Wow, I mean, good to be here in Calgary. Good to see so much interest in the public policy debate. This is a difficult subject and a difficult area to make progress in. I think what you're going to hear from the four of us, we have very different backgrounds. But actually, we believe in, we've spent a considerable amount of time and effort taking a lot of these conversations. And so you'll hear some similarities in some of the things we're going to say. I'd like to double underscore some of the things that have been said already. Polarization is a huge issue. Coming into the room with a fixed view and not opening your mind is not helpful. It's not helpful to the cause you're often supporting. It doesn't matter whether it's right wing or left wing or strong environment or strong anti-environment. Doesn't matter. If you come in with too fixed a view and without an open mind, the chances of you getting into a space where you can take the debate forward and make progress and actually start to solve some of these fundamental underlying scientific and economic issues is greatly reduced. So, me and Ed have spent some time together, and, we're unlikely bed partners. It's tough. We've often had to meet on Saturdays and Sundays in the dark of night where people don't know who we are. And we spent several years trying to do that, to try and find a way of taking this very difficult and polarized conversation forward. So my biggest worry is polarization. And think about the fundamental purpose, ethics of the structure of the organizations involved in that debate. And none of us are going to get away scot-free up here. So, politicians, we talk about wedge issues now. Wedge issues are about driving people to the extremes. That's one of the issues we have. You have companies who are so fixed they won't accept science and conventional wisdom. That doesn't help the debate. You have NGOs who don't have an existence often unless there is a campaign and something to attract funding in the short term. Solving problems doesn't create the majority of NGOs that we know today. So we all of us, the companies have issues, the politicians have challenges, the NGOs and think tanks have challenges. And so I think the answer is about, and I don't even like the phrase balance environment and economy. The two fit like a hand in glove. If you don't have a healthy environment, you can't have a healthy economy. If you don't have a healthy economy, you cannot have a healthy environment, and the world is littered with examples of that, some of which we've heard about. So, being bold and getting into the solution space, I think, is the challenge.
Great. So let me pick up on the polarization, the existence of safe middle ground, the difficulty to communicate with the voters, the people. All of those things are exactly why the Ecofiscal Commission was created. We knew we were stepping into a polarized policy space. We were searching for that safe middle ground, searching to build consensus. And we thought that an important part of the puzzle, not the whole puzzle, but an important part of the puzzle was pricing. David Dodge talked about using the price system. We, as a group of economists, think about little else, frankly, other than pricing. We're very simple people. I would like to ask Jen to tell us why pricing, what is the logic for why pricing ought to be, at least in principle, that safe middle ground. And anybody else can jump in on that as well. But I'd also like to ask Jean Charest why it's so difficult to explain why pricing, and we don't have to talk about climate if you don't want. We can talk about water. We can talk about, forestry practices. We can talk about traffic congestion. You can talk about residential garbage by the bag. Pick your issue. But why does pricing make sense, actually, and why is it so tough?
So it doesn't always make sense. I just want to clarify.
Holy smokes.
But for emissions or environmental problems where it's easy to observe, that means it's easy to price. And economists like pricing because it's a minimalist way of government intervention, which means the administrative burden on both governments and households and businesses is fairly low relative to a regulatory solution. The example I like to give is we could price emissions and let people decide and let businesses decide, or we could have a government mandate that everyone has to get a smart thermostat to control the temperature in their house. And if we're mandating that every household has to have a smart thermostat, then we enter into government audits and what type of smart thermostat is the appropriate smart thermostat, and like just problems like that. So that is one of the reasons why economists like pricing and why it's generally an appropriate mechanism to address environmental problems.
Does anybody want to add anything to that? Why is it that economists claim that it is the lowest cost way to do things?
Oh, because it is. I mean, it's very effective. But let me share an experience on pricing with you, because I think when politicians or governments propose a pricing mechanism to their constituents, they suffer from a very severe credibility gap, a deficit in terms of their credibility on the integrity of the policy they're proposing, because the public has learned from experience that what the initial intent was ends up being perverted with time and the money's diverted elsewhere. And I'm sorry to report that that's corroborated by a lot of experiences. I mean, that's what happens. Now, in Quebec, for example, I was very frustrated by the fact that we have the lowest hydro costs in North America, 60% less than Ontario, 300% less than the state of New York. And the policy implemented by, and this was before I was elected, is that what they call local consumption, the patrimonial block, was sold at a low price, below the cost of production. Well, you know what? Quebecers ended up convincing themselves that this was a rent. It was a right, a rent. I remember my dad, who I loved. I thought he was great, and there was a story in the paper about us increasing hydro prices and him chewing me out and saying to me, Jean, we own it. Why are we... And I was frustrated by the environment groups in Quebec never, ever raised the issue with us to say, you know what, you should be increasing the price of hydro for environmental reasons. Why? Because it wasn't popular. And we ended up doing that, but we paid a very high political price. Water. Immigrants from France who come to Quebec, the first thing that strikes them when they rent an apartment, they ask the owner, where's the meter for the water? There is no meter. Just open the tap. And in Canada, there is an irony, Chris, that we have this pristine environment, this perception that we're very environmentally friendly. We're the biggest consumers of water per capita in the world, biggest producers of garbage per capita in the world, biggest producers of energy per capita in the world. And I'm exaggerating a bit, but if we're not in the first, we're certainly among the first 4 or 5 because of our innate culture. And that's part of the challenge that we need to address. Pricing addresses that. But the integrity in convincing constituents that that system is going to be respected because it's a substitute to other sources of revenue is a great, big challenge.
So if you can't convince your father...
He voted for me anyway.
One dinner... Sorry?
He voted for him anyway.
Actually, my dad's biggest problem is that I was a liberal in Quebec. No kidding. He wouldn't take a membership card. Still voted for me. Gave me money, too.
Okay, so if we can't convince our fathers over a few dinners, how are we going to convince people? Steve, or maybe you want to address something else. I'm not sure.
No, and I'm just taking it slightly broader. I mean, I think pricing is a tool. It's a very effective tool. One of the reasons we love the fundamentals of economics is because it rises above everything else if you can get it there. I suspect in this context, and context is really important, you're going to have to use other tools as well. And part of the reason for that is, much as we'd like to think we're important, on the CO2 balance on the planet, Canada is a relatively small part. If we shut Canada down tomorrow, we won't really move the dial. So a lot of the conversation for us is, how do we become leaders? How do we start to get the right conversation happening? How do we use the right tools? But that context is critical. If all we did was, let's say we put price of a ton of CO2 up to $200-300 a ton tomorrow, all we do is shut Canada down. It would have no impact on the global demand for hydrocarbons. It wouldn't affect the CO2 in the atmosphere. So we'd have done huge local damage and not taken the planetary circumstance forward. So we always have to take these tools in that context. And that's been the frustrating part about this debate. There's a jurisdictional issue. What we do at the Canadian level hasn't happened at the world level. One of the good things that happened was that Paris happened and there was a broader agreement. It's a difficult debate. So some people are stopping doing that because of the damage it's doing to their economy. Some are staying in the leadership position. I think where we need to aim to be is at the leading edge, but not doing so much damage that we're shutting our economy down. So it's finding that
So we're going to have to come back to that. So I want to come back to the how does Canada become a leader. But before we do that, I'd like you to respond to Jen's comment about pricing's not always the best way. And Steve said pricing is one tool of many. So what is it that makes a carbon price a good way to go about things? Not only a carbon price, but a carbon price. But give us an example where a price isn't the right way to deal with an environmental problem.
Yeah, I agree. Carbon pricing isn't the be-all and end-all. You need complementary policies. That's why, to take one example, the federal government's clean fuel standard, which is going after some of those harder to get at transportation emissions that aren't as well suited to carbon pricing. So you've got something that's on a carbon intensity base. They're very ambitiously moving after liquids. They're moving after gas. They're moving after solids. And when layered with a carbon price, then it starts to drive some of the emissions that have been promised under the Pan-Canadian framework. So bottom line is you need complementary policies. But carbon pricing, let's not understate its importance. For me, early on in the debate, I knew that it was something valuable because it passed the two Bruces rule. And by the two Bruces, those of us who are veterans of the Winnipeg Consensus and all the other different debates about national energy strategy, remember being in Winnipeg and standing in a room, and future Minister Jim Carr was there, and you had Bruce Cox, the head of Greenpeace at the time, you had Bruce March, the head of Imperial Oil at the time, and both of them nodding their heads in agreement that carbon pricing is the right thing to do. So if you have those two saying this is what we should do, then I think you have a good sort of climate consensus. I'd say the problem is, and perhaps to pick up on Jean's point, is we all thought we got carbon pricing in place, and then we're absolutely terribly poorly equipped to communicate it after the fact, including governments. Governments themselves didn't know how to communicate it. They don't know how to communicate climate in general. So we roll it out, and people are saying, in this province, why are you coming in replacing my light bulb? And I'm not getting paid for that, but you're dinging me at the pumps. And so it would bring out people, and Steve, you were very admirably, you spoke, very frequently about carbon pricing. You would do your work. And what we found is that we needed to have conversations elsewhere. And as much as I like listening to you, Steve, when you look at credibility, and same with me when I was starting Pembina, if you look at credibility, we're not credible in the eyes of the general public. And therefore, we left ourselves wide open to attack, saying, you're just paying, it's not doing anything, let's get rid of it.
Okay, so I'm going to give you an assignment, and I'm going to come back to you in a few minutes. So you get some time to think about the assignment. The assignment is you're in the elevator with some ordinary members of the general public. The elevator is going to go up, 30 floors. You've got 1 minute. 1 minute to explain why carbon pricing is sensible. You get about 5 minutes to think about that.
You're not my prof, Chris.
I don't know if I could. I don't know where you...
I reject the assignment.
I don't think you can do that for the next hour. Okay, but I want to come back to Jen's mention at the beginning about the demand side and the supply side, and Stephen's comment about Canada becoming a leader. And if we shut down our emissions tomorrow to zero, there would be virtually no impact on the world. So what do people mean when they talk about the demand side and the supply side? The demand side of what, the supply side of what? And I know David talked about this, but let's just do it again. So who wants to take a shot at that?
I'll start and then open it up for more of a conversation. For all of the, I've been in the energy industry for nearly 45 years. I studied all sources of energy at university. In the first 10 years of my work, we were starting to write the Kyoto Accord. So, gosh, we're 40 years on now, and we've made virtually no progress. And by progress, I mean not that the conversations haven't gone on, not that this isn't a much healthier debate now, but the demand for hydrocarbons has gone up, I think, every single year on the planet since then. And the reason for that is it's just part of the fabric of our life. People liken it to tobacco. It's not a discretionary use of fossil fuels. Life as we know it, half the people in this room wouldn't be alive if it was 200 years ago at this age, because life expectancy has moved that much on the back of an energy-intensive economy. That's about fresh water, it's about food, it's about employment, it's about heat, it's about the ability to get to the place of work. And it's about the medicine and the education that's gone with that. So the consequences of this debate are huge. That's why economy and environment go so well together, because if you take it in, if you don't have water and you don't have food, and you don't have a job, you don't have the luxury of taking the debate we're taking today. So it's very easy for us to impose stance. But I'll tell you, I was sat with one of the architects of the Chinese economy as we know it today. And he said the biggest problem we have, Steve, is we can't trust Canada. Can you believe that? We can't trust Canada. We would desperately like to shut down this growth program and installation of these coal-fired power stations we've got, but we can't. You can't build your LNG, you can't get your oil to the coast, and we can't depend on you. So we've just signaled to start the coal building again. How does that make environmental sense? So the bigger debates, the leadership debate, you have to start somewhere. And I think one of the things Ed and myself learned, and gosh, it was a tough conversation, is sometimes you've just got to be bold. You've got to stand up and you've got to take a step in the right direction, knowing full well you don't have a complete solution to the problem. And so leadership, I think, is what we've done. 10 years ago, if I went into global, and I did go into global environmental conversations, Canada was a laggard. When we went into Paris this time, we were clapped into the room. People see Canada is standing up and trying to take on these very complex debates. Can we solve it from here? No. Do we have the tools that are going to get us all the way? No. Can we make progress? Yes. But that requires brave people getting in a room, talking about solutions and making progress. And we are now starting to become a technological and innovation country that people are standing up and recognizing around the world. So we have the chance to start making the difference. But we can't bury ourselves. You know, the fact is, if we don't produce this stuff, it's going to be produced in Russia, it's going to be produced in South America, it's going to be produced in the Middle East, and the world wants Canada to produce the next barrel of crude oil. That's what the world is telling us.
Perfect. So the assignment, yours, is to answer that question. But I've decided who your member of the general public is in the elevator. Is Jean Charest's father. So we've got you and Jean Charest's father in an elevator, and why is a carbon price a useful part of solving that problem, of Canada being a leader and helping to make progress on this issue?
I'm going to give him 10 seconds to think even a little bit more, because I think carbon price can be, I think it is potentially part of the answer.
Okay, so hold on. So at the top of the building, you're going to get out and he's going to get in, and Jean Charest's father stays there. Okay, and then we're going to get his answer. Go.
As long as you play Jean Charest's father. So, ding. You're in the elevator with me, Chris. You're Jean Charest's father.
Bonjour.
Bonjour. Est-ce qu'on peut parler en anglais? Okay.
C'est quoi?
Hi. How's your day going? I'm
Good, thank you.
I'm Ed. Ken.
My name is Jean Charest's father.
Nice to meet you, Jean Charest's
Monsieur
father.
Charest.
Can I talk to you about carbon pricing?
Why?
Have you talked to your doctor about carbon pricing recently? No, in all seriousness. Okay. Carbon pricing. Listen, it's a matter of economists agree that you put a price on something that you want to incent. You incent what you want, and you put a price on something that you don't want. What we have, and I'd use the word pollution, we've got too much carbon pollution. We put a price on it, let business figure it out. Business is way smarter, way faster than government. They'll design tools, and we'll take care of the problem. So I'm appealing to business. Ding, Steve gets in.
So my question is, it just sounds like another tax grab. And it's not going to make a difference because I still drive to work, don't I?
Well,
Because I still have to get to work. I don't know if I still work, but I'm going to go with it.
you still, yeah. But now, see, now I'm getting into what an economist would say.
That's okay. That's always
But
good.
we can say, listen, we've got jurisdictions that have experience with it, where we're giving them encouragement to drive less, to take public transit, to buy more fuel-efficient cars, and that's good for the economy, and it's good for you. And then we take that as government, and we recycle that into producing jobs. jobs for people that involve helping Canada to transition away to a low-carbon economy. And that includes having a healthy oil and gas sector as well, because we need a strong balance sheet to do that in order for us to transition to where everyone tells us where we need to go.
Okay. Now, you got in the elevator. What is your pitch similar to that?
No, I think I'm going to argue from a different point of view,
Okay,
which is probably the one that Ed would normally have, is it can be one of the tools. That's why I said it. Badly designed, badly executed, it won't work. So if all it becomes is additional tax grab, then it will probably fail. That's why we talked about the need for recycling, the need for overall neutrality in terms of tax. If this tax comes up, and I think we could have a conversation maybe later about the principle of you've got to pay for the pollution or the effect you're having on the environment is an important one. But where you square that, where you square it at the individual or at the company or at the province or the country or world level is very difficult. But if the carbon price on its own is not good enough. You have to have a price which probably is going to increase as people become more aware of the full cycle of consequences of consumption of fossil fuels. But you have to start, and you want to incent the right behaviour. So some of that is putting it into a different mix of energy, a different balance of solar and wind, and all of those things have a part to play. And you probably want to incent technology and innovation in there, because the stuff which is happening is changing the world. It used to be that the carbon footprint of oil sands was significantly heavier than crude oil. On this continent now, it's equal to crude oil. It's on its way to being less than crude oil. We have the ability and the technology capability to drive this thing down, but we need the right policy to do it. Price helps that, but you've got to have some of these other things as well. So my guess is that a combination of price, regulation, and subsidizing things which won't get off the ground unless you encourage them, and let the market sort it out. The market will sort it out.
Okay, so we're going to come back to that mix, but you also talked about what to do with the revenues, how to recycle the revenues, and the importance of revenue neutrality. So I want to ask an economist about what's the argument for revenue neutrality, or close to revenue neutrality, but then I want to ask a former premier to say, does that make it easier to sell to the people if you're going to raise revenues through some form of carbon price, whether it's cap and trade or a tax, and then lower revenues on sales taxes, income taxes, corporate income taxes? Does that make it an easier sell? So let's start with the economist and then go to the politician.
Okay, so we all know that carbon pricing imposes a cost on the economy, and the idea behind revenue recycling or revenue neutrality is using the revenue raised from the carbon pricing to lower the cost of other taxes on the economy. And so the idea is you can potentially entirely mitigate the negative effects from carbon pricing. And it really depends on the state of the tax system. Bev has done tons of work in this area.
So can we mitigate the impact on a household, or is it we're mitigating the impact in some aggregate sense? Can I actually make the impact, the purchasing power impact, nil, household by household?
Well, sure. Yes, but it requires a lot of information on the part of governments. It's like they essentially would need to know exactly what each household is spending on energy and their emissions footprint, and that's not feasible. So it's an average recycling across the economy, and it really depends on how the government chooses to recycle the revenue. I mean, there are lots of ways to do it. It could be lowering corporate taxes. It could be lowering personal income taxes. It could be lump sum
But let's stick with the household, because when I go across the country and I talk about this, one of the classic questions I get, people will look at me, they'll roll their eyes. I get that a lot. They'll say, you economists are in la-la land. You're going to take money from me on the one hand with a carbon tax, and then you're going to give me money back, and you think you're accomplishing something? Why is this sensible?
I spent 2 hours at a Christmas dinner trying to explain that to my parents.
Was Jean Charest's father there? No?
No.
Probably hang around with my father.
I mean, the problem, well, so to be very technical and nerdy for just a moment, it's income and substitution effects. And that's something that economists understand and something that no one else does. And it's really hard to explain in words. And it's like economists, we all have these graphs in our head and we know what's going on, but we have a lot of trouble explaining why it makes sense. And so the answer is yes, it makes sense, but it also depends on the politics of the situation and the state of the economy. And I think Jean can better answer this, but it's what government does with the revenue is, I think, an entirely separate question from whether or not carbon pricing is a good idea. But what governments do with the revenue can help sell the idea of carbon pricing.
For those of you who were intrigued by the income and substitution effects, it's chapter 6 in the country's leading textbook on economics. Jean Charest, how do we explain how carbon pricing works, or sorry, about revenue neutrality, and how does that help the pitch?
Well, let me start in defense of my dad, who just went for an elevator ride. He's passed away, by the way. So his reaction to Ed, and knowing him, and to Steve would be, "Who are these weirdos?" And the second comment would have been, "Get your hand out of my pocket." Yeah. And I do want to make a comment on before I answer your question, where is Canada in this broader debate? And we've been involved in these debates for a long time, and I was at Rio, and we were the first country of the G7 to announce our decision to sign the Climate Change Convention and the Biodiversity Convention. We were very active, and the view at the time, and I think it still holds today, it goes this way: even if we're only 0.5% of the world's population and 2.5% of the GDP, this issue affects us probably more than the average nation, especially with the northern climate. And anyone, by the way, I'm not a scientist, but you know, on climate change, I've been to the north a lot, and the changes have happened at a speed that is virtually unthought of. I mean, never, you can visually, in Canada, the difference, you can see the changes. Now, why? It's about leadership. It's about because it affects us, the issue is we should, and the world expects us to lead, and rightfully so. We're part of the G7, we're part of the G20. I mean, there's responsibilities that come with that. Now, on the tax, my view is that the whole issue of substituting or offsetting is the issue at play here is acceptability. It will determine whether or not the constituents will accept that or not. Now, how do you do it is the challenge. And I was thinking, as you were talking, Jan, that, you know, when we implemented the GST, which was politically very successful. There was 2 of us left after the campaign in '93. But mind you, no one has affected that since then, even though there were great promises to do away with it. When we did that, we implemented a policy where households were reimbursed and individuals were reimbursed directly if they were under a certain income level. You can design systems where there is that direct connection. And I think that if we did that, then we would be in business. If it's a general commitment, and I'll share my experience, in 2006 we did a $200 million carbon tax, straight tax. First time in the country it had been done. Very much under the radar, and industry didn't react too much because I think they thought, why attract attention to this? We create a green fund to fund projects too. Now, over time, the green fund ended up in all sorts of projects, honestly, that were questionable. And then people, you know, they're onto it. British Columbia were the first ones to successfully implement a more comprehensive policy with a substitution with the, and I think it worked, but now I understand that that's being questioned, that the money is, in the view of a number of British Columbians, being diverted. So we could very well, to answer your question, design a system that says there will be a tax on carbon, and yes, households and individuals based on income will be reimbursed. And when and that ties you pretty much down, because if the check stops coming in, then politically you're in trouble. That could work.
Yep. Could I just just build upon this and perhaps state the obvious when it comes to carbon pricing. It is ferociously difficult to communicate, and I think we're living evidence of that. And I can see former politicians in the room who have tried to communicate this before, nodding their heads in agreement. And I'm sure we have professional communicators who listen to what I have to say, and they're like, I realize it's been a while since I've had to communicate it. But what we have, the ultimate test will be the elections we have coming up. We've got the past history, and mentioning BC, where it survived a few elections. We've been pricing carbon for industry in this province since the early mid-2000s. It survived multiple elections. Now we're going to have tests in Alberta, in Ontario, it's a factor on Thursday, and then federally to see an economy-wide carbon price. Are we communicating? Does the voter get it? One thing I know the voter increasingly, and I think without question, is they understand climate change is a thing, and they know that carbon pricing is associated with doing something on climate. That much we know. So we'll have a much better sense of our success in communicating, I think, this time next year.
Chris, could I rapidly make a comment about, you said something early on about we've started this work and now here we are, and rightfully so. Are we making progress? We seem to be going backwards. But what do we have in front of us? In Ontario, an election tomorrow where one of the big issues is hydro prices and energy prices. So the issue of carbon is rolled into that debate. Alberta, it's rolled into the pipeline debate. Federally, bigger issue, the American neighbors just changed their whole tax structure and they're deregulating, and it's rolled into that debate. So we cannot not take that into account, and those are the things we have to deal with as we advance on this discussion.
Okay, I'd like to actually invite anybody who wants to ask a question to go to the microphone. I'd actually like to go a little bit more on the revenue issue. But if there's somebody that's ready to ask a question, we can take them now. Ken on the left.
So I'm entering the elevator with the 4 people in the room minus Chris, and here's what I say. Jen, how'd you like an expanded childcare program for your children? Ed, how'd you like more money to subsidize solar power and wind power? Steve, how'd you like a lower corporate tax rate? And Mr. Charest, how would you like to go into the next election offering a broad middle-class tax cut? And suddenly I've got all of your attention, but sooner or later in this conversation you're going to say to me, how are we going to pay for this? And I'm going to say, we are going to tax pollution like we tax cigarettes.
All right. So, are we listening?
My point.
Who was that guy that just got out of the elevator?
I would have got off.
My point,
Off
Chris.
the floor before.
My point, Chris, is that I've had the privilege of working for 2 politicians who have successfully sold a carbon price, and they did it by not talking about carbon pricing. Yeah. They talked about the benefits of the revenues and what they could do with it. So I think, Ed, I was shaking my head when you were talking, because that's exactly the conversation that turns off the public. And I think if we're going to have this debate, if we're going to have this discussion, we need to lead with, as politicians, and I spend my life advising those poor souls, we need to start thinking about how do we communicate the benefits first. So we have a child care program, we have money for wind and solar, we have a cut in the corporate tax rate, and we have a broad tax cut that we sell across the middle class. And if you want to see an example of all of what I've just described, there's a little document in Ontario called the People's Guarantee. That's now in a ditch in Etobicoke, but it was there for a while.
Okay, so we might want to look for that ditch in Etobicoke. Any comments on that?
I mean, just to say, I don't think
From
there was
a communications point of view, but also an economic point of view.
I don't think there was a question per se, but I think we're agreed. We've got to start it's all about context. We can't have what we have today if all we do is switch these things immediately off. It is, the fossil fuels and the CO2 emissions and the climate change issue are at the very heart and fabric of our society. So it has to be about what our values are, you know, our education, our healthcare, our transportation systems, the design of our cities. And it has to be about the good and the bad things, because that's what the voter is voting on at the end of the day anyway. They're looking at, am I happy with this or am I happy with some other mix? And the consequence of some of the things that are happening is people are taking a hard turn in a different direction. And that means, in a sense, we've failed in this bigger debate because we've not been able to sell the overall mid and long-term advantages of what we're proposing. So I think it has to be taken in the context of what people value.
It's interesting from a communications point of view, though, that you started by not using a carbon price as a way to solve a problem. It was, let's talk about things that you would like, and then let's finance that with this thing. And oh, and by the way, you'll get a cleaner environment too, right? You didn't say that part, but you could have said that. But yeah, maybe the right people weren't in the elevator. Does anybody else has a response to that? Because I'm actually going to take a couple of questions without answering them. We're just going to take your questions quickly, and then we'll deal with them, okay? So, sir?
What I keep on hearing is the polarization. But I hear David Dodge wants to, develop an awful lot more energy and export it. And anytime we start developing energy, we run into the question of how much input the Indigenous people have. And the Indigenous people, that issue gets wrestled by industry, by governments, and by the judiciary. Now, Jean Charest, you've been in 2 levels of government, and you've witnessed the Clarity Act, which handled a thorny question. Would it be worthwhile for the Parliament of Canada to come out with a Clarity Act, what Indigenous people, what their rights should be on input on various policies?
Okay, thank you. So this is, we're just going to take the question and not answer it yet. So clarity on Indigenous rights and responsibilities. Yes, number 2.
So I wanted to go back to something that David Dodge said, that we should use the revenue income and income from fossil sales to pay for a reduction of emissions from consumption. And I think there's been a lot of, if we think about a pot of money, I'm interested in what the panelists think about the right policy choices to make in terms of spending that money to reduce emissions from consumption versus from production. So how should that money be divided? There's been a lot of debate around who that money should go to and what makes the most sense, maybe in the short term and maybe in the long term. But fundamentally, what would you do with that, and how would you divide it between those 2 pots of emissions from consumption versus production?
So the distribution of those revenues. And sir, I'll just take your question, and I'm not going to take the other ones just yet. Sir, yours.
So my question really relates to some of the different issues that need decisions. And everybody on the panel spoke to the merits of consensus and compromise and the problems with dogmatism and polarization. But how do we make decisions in contexts where the issues are mostly deontological for some of the constituencies? That is, they're questions of right and wrong for the environmental protesters or for industry in some cases. And how do you see that unfolding in issues like pipelines, oil sands, to a lesser extent fracking, as we go forward?
Okay, so thank you very much. So let's work with these 3. So one is, can we be more clear about Indigenous rights and responsibilities? I hope I've represented that correctly. What to do about the revenues from pollution pricing or carbon pricing? How should those be distributed? So this definitely connects to the issue of revenue recycling and perhaps revenue neutrality. And how do we make decisions? This seemed to be, how do we make decisions in a way that builds and maintains consensus? He didn't use the word consensus, but I think it was there. So who would like to start on, you decide how you want to take those on.
I would start just on, let's have some optimism about something. So we're making real progress on the Indigenous file. We live where we have operations. We have, we plan to be part of, for example, the Fort McMurray community for the next 500 years, if our long-term plan works out. And we have been able to do deals which are very encouraging with our neighbours there. So I don't know if you've heard, we did last year a $500 million deal with the two local bands that are close to us. And what that's effectively done is that they've been able to partner with us in a 50-year investment there. So they will take an income of somewhere between $25 and $45 million a year at current rates for that period. That gives them the stability to be able to fund their communities. They can start to have long-term plans. They can look at their own housing, education, infrastructure. So there are some really good things going on out there. And I suspect that part of the current pipeline discussion we're having at the moment will have some similar components of how can we do long-term deals, because then they're seeing the real benefits of things which they have rights to. So it's very encouraging. Those, in fact, some of those bands and chiefs are now becoming advocates for this is partly their resource. They want to see it develop so that they can get the very benefits we're talking about, so they can plan and balance their future. So some encouraging stuff going on.
Okay, thank you. Jen, you want to take any one of those?
I'll talk about revenue, I think. And I want to make the point that there's nothing particularly special about revenue from carbon pricing. It's like any other government source of revenue. The purpose of the carbon price is to change behavior, but the revenue from it is just the same as the revenue from personal or corporate income taxes or the GST. So when we're talking about what to do with the revenue, it's the same conversation as what to do with the revenue from any other source of government revenue. And then it's about what is the best way to spend government money, and that's about, again, value is about education, infrastructure, healthcare spending, etc.
The economist within me completely agrees with what you said. We often talk about the fungibility of money, and if you collect $1 from a GST or you collect $1 from whatever, it goes into a bucket, and then the question is, what do you want to do with it? It's about government priorities. It doesn't matter how you raised it. But that's not the way normal people think. One of the things I've realized after 30 years, it took me probably 20 years to realize this, that economists are not normal people. Now, you may have known that for some time, but I was slow coming to that realization. Economists are distinctly not normal people. When Ecofiscal wrote its report called Choose Wisely, which was all about revenue recycling from a carbon price, we actually did some polling. We did some new polling. We asked people, we gave them 6 or 7 options, and we asked them to rank how they think the money should be spent. And for the most part, those normal people disagree with us economists. They actually think it matters what you spend it on. Most people actually tend to think that if the revenue is generated from this thing called a carbon price that is designed to reduce emissions, then you should spend it on something that also reduces emissions and is kind of part of that policy effort. So the economist within me kind of rolls my eyes and goes fungibility, fungibility. But the normal person that is emerging slowly thinks, well, maybe people have a point.
Can I respond?
Absolutely, you should respond,
okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I agree. Maybe not that economists are not normal, but we definitely have an interesting way of looking at the world. I think it's, a part of it is the salience of the issue, in that a lot of times the response to carbon pricing is, oh, it's not going to work because I'm not changing my behavior. And so it's a little bit of, and to me, that just means, oh, the price isn't high enough for you to change your behavior. When we think about subsidizing or subsidizing wind farms or solar panels and things like that, or changing everyone's light bulbs in Alberta, there's a lot of salience, and so people can see the change. Or and as opposed to something that's fairly amorphous in that we now have a price on emissions and somehow it's going to trickle through the economy and maybe I'll change my behavior, but probably not. And so I think that's why there's such a divide between how economists would answer the revenue and recycling question and how normal people think about it.
I am delighted to hear that you think you're a normal person as well as an economist. Because I don't meet very many who are both.
Chris, you should try running a group full of engineers. No,
I come from a family of engineers. Actually, I've tried to avoid them most of my life.
Usually big engineers produce little engineers, but they.
I didn't try to avoid them because they were engineers, just because they were my family.
A lot of family dynamics on this panel, but yeah.
Jean Charest, do you want to take one of those questions on?
Yeah, thank God I'm a lawyer. Helps increase the, let me, and Chris, there were questions connected to the lady, ma'am, I didn't catch your name, but about, the revenue side. And let me start first by saying something that Janice would know, and Jim and David. In departments of finance, there's always an immediate reaction and resistance to any targeted funding, because the money goes into the Consolidated Revenue Fund, and for good reason, because the argument they'll make to officials is, listen, if you target the funding, we don't know how the world is going to evolve, and you should allow yourself the maximum flexibility to allocate resources where they need to go, and it makes sense. But in certain cases, the price to pay to be able to get policy done, if it's important enough, requires targeted funding. Now, again, I'm back to the GST, which was extremely unpopular, but in the end, it was designed in such a way where people over a certain threshold of revenue received compensation and they received a check. And so we are able to design those systems to make them credible and to make them work, so we can do that. It is possible mechanically to make it happen, and if we believe this is important enough, then we should be able to do that. On Paul Gagnon's question on First Nations, it's work in progress, and it is a mixed bag in the country. Work in progress because I think, on a day-to-day basis, it often looks difficult, but we've made extraordinary progress. My experience in Quebec is also mixed. We did a Plan A for northern Quebec. There's 4 nations, First Nations, that were there, and we were relatively successful in engaging them. But one thing, and I'm sure, Steve, you've had the experience, one thing we all underestimate is how much of an effort we have to make upstream. We think we're making the effort. Actually, we should stop. We're not making enough of an effort, even if we think we are, in engaging with First Nations. The second thing, in all honesty, that's very difficult for policymakers is that the leadership of the First Nations is very much a mixed story. Some of them have capacity, others don't have capacity. And then we find ourselves in a situation, in a room, where we have to compensate, and that's painful and it's difficult, and there's no answer to that. Should there be, because every time there seems to be a Supreme Court ruling, the goalpost moves, and it seems to move in the direction of more complication, more difficulty. Should there be, I never thought of the Clarity Act concept, Paul, but it's not a bad idea. But it would require a buy-in from the First Nations to say, well, we've been through all these rulings. Can we sit down? One comment on that, industry is asking government to play a role. Whose role is it to do that? Now, there is a role for government. When I was doing Plan A, the mining industry did agreements on royalties, and they came to us saying to us, we do these private agreements, but we'd like to know what our neighbor is doing, and are we in the ballpark or not? But really, there's no one who can tell us unless government assumes that overall arcing responsibility of setting the parameters of what is acceptable, what is not, what's good, what's not, based on previous experience. And yes, I think the federal government in that regard could play a very important role in helping everyone figure out what it is and how we should approach the First Nations and what kind of deals can be made that are good for everyone.
Perfect. I'm going to go to questions after Ed gives us a response. So questions are coming up, and I'm hoping that we can start talking after Ed about the Pan-Canadian framework, because carbon pricing policies in this country are both at the provincial level and soon at the federal level. And I want to talk about how that's working or not working. But first, Ed, you get your response to those 3 questions.
I think we've adequately covered the first 2 questions, so let me just talk about the third one briefly about making decisions. I have a lot of sympathy for Peter Watson, Gaetan Caron Forum, and the NEB. Because when we're talking about decisions, let's recognize the obvious. We're talking about NEB decision-making, pipelines, and it's a question asked, is determination or right or wrong? Because an energy regulator like that is forced to make a decision, a yay or nay decision, in the national interest, when we still have the national interest really poorly defined.
Yes.
So in the absence of a clearly defined national interest, you've got a hodgepodge of regional interests. Thus the massive bun-throwing fight that we've been through for many, many years. So I was encouraged when actually in this city, going back to the late 2000s, that in this city first, we could put national energy strategy together, and we didn't have to worry about the ghost of Trudeau the Elder coming out and haunting whatever room you're in, this room, around the national energy program. We were way ahead of Ottawa. Ottawa caught up to it later. We've had lots of promises with now the Canadian Energy Regulator and even the Impact Assessment Agency, and yet we still haven't delivered. And until we actually get that clearly defined picture, and it's embedded into the core of Canadian Energy Regulator, and we take decisions out of cabinet, which right now is disappointed to see that, ultimate decision-making authority is still in the hands of cabinet. Until we have that, then we'll still have balkanization of interests, and we're gonna have bun-throwing fights.
Okay, great. Let's turn to some, I'm gonna collect 3 more questions. So on the left, Antonia.
So my question relates directly to that. Monsieur Charest, when you were Premier of Quebec, one of the things that you put into place was to give a voice for provinces through form of federations. And I'm wondering if this isn't another moment where we need that kind of leadership that can merge both what's happening across the provinces, but also at the federal level, to get us out of what seems to be this intractable debate. One, for the health of the pan-Canadian debate, but also something that Mr. Williams said, which is that if externally our street cred is being undermined by the fact that we can't get our own internal conversations and dialogue going, doesn't that have an even greater long-term impact, not only on our economic health, but really the reputation of Canada as a whole?
Okay, great. Thank you. That's number 1. There's a question over here. Number 2.
Can I play the part of Jean Charest's dad?
I know, is he here to ask a question?
I'm quite similar to him, I'm sure, in a lot of ways. Mr. Whittingham, you tell me that this is the best way, the cheapest way of reducing Canada's carbon emissions. Why do we have to reduce Canada's carbon emissions? And I think that's the key to the question that Jean Charest's dad is going to say, because he's been told by many people, many politicians, that this isn't even a discussion we should be having. So you've mentioned that polarization is a big part of the challenges, and I would like to suggest that that polarization, part of that is that one set of politicians isn't even playing on the same table as you. So one group of politicians are saying, I like this shade of gray, and another set of politicians are saying, I like this shade of blue, and another set of politicians are saying, I really like bananas. They're just not even on the same page. They're in a different book. So and to be fair, we've got some right-wing politicians, Jean Charest, Preston Manning, Jim Dinning here, who are flaunting that convention, but the current sitting politicians are on the right, I'll say it, and are telling a lot of the people in this room, a lot of the citizens of Canada, that this isn't a discussion we should be having.
So, sir, I just want to clarify. Your question is, why should Canada reduce or try to reduce its emissions?
No, it's actually, how do we have this discussion when a great subset of the population, led by a great subset of our political leaders, are not willing to have the conversation?
I see. Okay, thank you. Okay, number 3.
Hi, everyone. It's funny that I'm actually a petroleum engineer and I'm sitting here. My question is, besides carbon pricing, what do you think of regulatory development and other alternative solutions? I would like to point out that Alberta's upstream oil and gas company actually exempt from carbon pricing until 2023. Because the Alberta Energy Regulator is developing the regulatory for the upstream venting, flare, and incinerating. And I personally just don't think carbon pricing doesn't work because it's not like high enough, I will change my behavior. Like no matter how high, I will still use the fossil fuel in winter, like to keep my house warm. Like it just like make it worse, and like the final results just I will leave Canada and like I won't do business with Canada because you are carbon pricing to penalize foreigners. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think it's skepticism that carbon price will change behavior, but also a question about why some upstream emitters appear to be exempted from policy. I think, did I get that right? Okay, we're going to go with that. Sure. All right. So thank you very much. Those are the three questions we're going to go for. Does anybody want to take a shot at any one of those?
Let me just tackle the notion of carbon pricing not being high enough in upstream emitters. So what Alberta has done in its carbon pricing policy, it's done a bunch of things. Complementary policies, the carbon tax that we know and where it applies. It's got the emissions limit to give the world certainty that our greenhouse gas footprint in the oil sands will be 100 megatons and no more. But I think importantly to go after some of those hard to get emissions while recognizing that industry needs to stay competitive, it's taking a regulatory approach on methane. And it started here, it's often overlooked, but it started here. It's tough to do, we're phasing it in, but if we tackle methane properly, Canada got on board, BC got on board, we had the US regulating not just existing new sources, but existing sources, and we're actually creating jobs in how to reduce methane, and we know the rest of the world is going to, all oil and gas producing jurisdictions have to tackle it.
Can I put you on the spot, Steve, to answer the question? So, you are a large energy producer. Are you going to, facing a carbon price that is in Alberta, that is scheduled to rise gradually over time, but that has also this output-based pricing mechanism, is Suncor going to reduce its emissions or its emissions per barrel of oil produced? Is that going to happen? And how is it going to happen?
Yeah. So let me just underscore the importance of how you ask the question there. So, I'm a producer of a significant proportion of the world's oil which is consumed. That's one conversation. And we talk, when we think about it, and broadly speaking, 20% of the CO2 in that is produced at the point of production, and 80% of it, 80, is produced at the point of consumption. So that's where you guys decide that you want to fly, or you want to wear these clothes, or you want to sit in these chairs, or you want the lights on. It's you making those decisions. So I'll answer it as, does in a sense carbon pricing work? Yes, it works. So our intensity, and that's why market forces are so successful, our energy intensity is 50% better than it was 15 years ago. So we now use half the amount of energy it takes us to produce a barrel of crude oil that it took us 15 years ago. And our, not just ambition, our stated plan is to reduce that another 30%. So we'd have reduced it by 80% by 2030. And we have the list of investments and projects which will move us from here to there. And that's not the limit of our ambition. So,
but some of that was happening without a carbon price.
Some of it, because in a sense there is a carbon price. Energy efficiency makes good economic sense. So one of our biggest costs is energy, the amount of energy we consume ourselves.
But a carbon price strengthens that argument.
So it strengthens that argument. And I think that's why economists are so comfortable with the pricing debate. It has clearly worked in the past, and it will clearly work in the future if the price is right. The difficulty is that if you want to solve all of the world's problems with pricing, you couldn't do that now. You'd have to push the price, $100, $200 a ton of CO2, and you'd destroy yourselves competitively, and that's not in anybody's interest, so it's where it starts to get complex. So yes, it works, and we will be reducing our energy consumption.
Okay, so I'd like to ask Jean Charest to comment on the reform of the Federation question, but then I'm going to come back to the two of you to ask for whether your view is that whether this output-based pricing, maybe you can explain that, but also tell us whether you think it undermines a carbon pricing policy. Or you can just reject the assignment, that's fine. But you have time to think. You have time to think while we go to Jean Charest.
Let me pick up a bit on what Steve said, and he's mentioned a few times this morning. One argument we need to make, we should not take for granted that people know, is that in and by itself, dealing with these issues makes economic sense. Put aside the carbon tax. And there are how many examples we have of that? And by the way, we have very successful examples of addressing some environmental issues with economic instruments that we should trot out. The Montreal Protocol on HCFCs and CFCs is probably the most successful one in the world, supported actively by the Ragan administration because it made good economic sense. And so, and then the second example is SO2 emissions, where the government of Brian Mulroney, Paul and I were part of that, made that a major feature of American U.S.-Canada relations. And there's now a trading system for SO2 emissions. It works. And an industry is more productive now, is more productive than it was before. So we need to return to those stories and tell them. Now, on your question, Antonio, it's a very interesting question. I want to relate to my experience. I think one of the mistake we made in politics, and I made, is that you enunciate policy and you're successful and you're in government, and because you've enunciated it and said it during the campaign, you think it's going to happen. Well, the world doesn't operate that way. In 2003, I get elected. I was hugely unpopular before the campaign, usually unpopular after the campaign. The only day I was good at was the election day, actually. Not a bad scheme, mind you, but I do this detailed program, right? It's all there. And then I implement the program, and when I get pushback from the electorate, they say, well, that's not what we wanted. I said, I put out my program, published it, I told you about it during the campaign. They weren't listening. They never paid attention to it. Let's revert to what we're experiencing now. The Liberals run, they say we're going to do a carbon tax, and they go out and they said, and now they're implementing it and say, well, we said we'd do it, right? And we're doing it. When in fact, I think there's a role for the federal government in Canada to play a role of a convener. And in our federal system of government, we haven't used that enough. The Americans have the concept of the bully pulpit. I don't think it applies to Canada. But we really underuse the federal government's ability to convene on certain issues and to assemble a point of view in our federal. And we're one of the most decentralized federations in the world, ladies and gentlemen. And the provinces control natural resources. This is not going to happen unless they are engaged. It's not enough to say, yeah, they have to be engaged. This isn't optional. And when you listen to the federal government, sometimes you get the impression that the provincial involvement is like optional. It's not. It is not going to happen otherwise. So I think the federal government, once they've said, fine, this is our position, they acknowledge they need to convince people and bring them alongside and convene them and use that ability and power, soft power they have, to be able to move the discussion. And I think they're not doing it now in a productive way, the way they should be doing it.
And Chris, so if I can build upon that, and I agree, and I'm encouraged that the federal government, as part of the Pan-Canadian framework, has built in these reviews. Because on carbon pricing, let's remember that the Pan-Canadian framework says, essentially, hey, we're all in this together. We have shared accountability, which is the backstop. We're sharing accountability. We've got this first period of 2018 to 2022 to get going. So let's get going. We're going to recognize different approaches, different systems, and we're going to have frequent check-ins where we can convene and see how we're doing. But we know, and to the question around the price isn't high enough, when you get to $50 a ton, then you're starting to get to something that's really, really material. On OBAs, in very
So we'll
quickly,
come back to the Pan-Canadian framework.
Yep.
So you want to explain what an OBA is?
A intensity-based allocation system, which just says, okay, let's not get into the granulars of OBAs,
Okay.
but let me just tell you about the world view, how my worldview changed from sitting around a table with Steve and his colleagues. So we came in, and without at the risk of telling tales out of school, we had CEOs, we had executive directors together in advance of the Alberta Climate Leadership Plan. And we came in, and I'd say we, the executive directors, said, all right, let's talk turkey. We want carbon tax. Carbon tax, economy-wide carbon tax, that's what we want. And industry, you know, you'd be fine with that, right? And Steve and his colleagues said, no, no. If you just put a flat tax on us, you're gonna shut down projects. And then when we got to common values, we realized that actually just shutting down projects with a flat tax was not what we wanted. Because if you really want Canada to transition, if you want jobs, then you need a tool that's going to create reinvestment. And over time, in multiple meetings and difficult conversations, we are convinced that it was a better approach than an economy-wide carbon tax. And it's going to take that kind of reinvestment opportunities that Steve and his colleagues need at their companies to help them with healthy balance sheets to transition. So that was a real turning point for me, and it really helped. You know, my lights went on. So I think it's a good system, and it's one of those sort of pancake-style complementary systems that we need.
Good. So I'm going to come to Jen for this. So this is the competitiveness issue. This is if we put a carbon price in place in Alberta or across Canada for that matter, and it's not happening in the United States or in South Korea or wherever it is that our firms are competing, we're then going to put our firms at a competitive disadvantage, because it'll pump up their costs, but they will then lose market share to their foreign rivals. Output will leave our jurisdiction, it will go to the foreign rivals, and what will happen is that emissions will fall here, but emissions will rise there. Globally, it'll be kind of a waste of time in terms of emissions, but we will bear the economic cost of that dislocation. So the competitiveness issue is designed, or it's all about trying to put a carbon price in place that addresses that issue. So this is where this output-based pricing comes in, and it's a fairly convoluted system. But in a sense, it is saying, all right, you're going to pay a carbon price on every ton of your emissions, but you're also going to receive. Think about two transactions that get squished together. One transaction is that you pay per ton of carbon emissions, but the other is that you receive support that provides you with an incentive to actually maintain production and employment. So you're faced with two different incentives. One is cut emissions. The other is don't cut emissions by getting smaller. You want to maintain production, maintain employment, and the two together say cut emissions by becoming less emissions intensive. Get cleaner, don't get smaller. Now, that's a tough thing to explain, as you might have just recognized, but I still am working on it. But what does the economics say? Is that sensible? And is it undermining a carbon price, or is it what you need to make the whole thing work?
So as Chris mentioned, this is fairly complex. And so let me first start with whether or not it undermines the carbon price. It depends what you mean by undermine, and it also depends on how it's structured. So if we mean undermine by emissions would be higher compared to the world where we just have the flat carbon tax, then yes, an output-based allocation system, or whatever you want to call it, would undermine the effectiveness of a carbon tax. But if we're thinking about the effectiveness of a carbon tax in terms of the incentive to lower emissions, then depending on how the OBA system is designed, then it does keep that incentive, but it does provide the revenue cost support to large emitters. And so it's complicated, and it really depends on how the system is designed. And so right now, the way Alberta is designing it, given my first definition of undermining, yes. Given my second, no.
So it seems to me that it's striking the balance. It's trying to reduce emissions, but maintain economic activity.
Well,
in those sectors.
it also depends how much money the government is putting towards these subsidies to businesses. And in theory, a government could give a big enough subsidy that totally overcomes the incentive created by the carbon tax. That's extremely unlikely to happen, but it could happen. And it really depends on the company's emissions profile and their emissions intensity.
Now, Steve, there are many things that impact the competitiveness of your business, right? Whether it's corporate income tax rates or regulations of various kinds, labor market, pension regulations perhaps, there's lots of things. But if you try to isolate the impact of the carbon pricing with the output-based pricing system together, how has that impacted, or how do you think it will impact your ability to run that business successfully?
It depends on the carbon price, and it depends what other people are doing. So one of the reasons I've been prepared to step forward in the conversation is I think for us to go to the leading edge will not, if you could just isolate it in itself, will not destroy the industry. Because there's a whole raft of other things. Now, if you add the other issues which we have in Canada at the moment, you had the royalty debate, you had the taxation debate, you had the corporate tax debate, you had the regulatory impasse we have where you put things into this machine and nothing comes out the other end for years. So there's no trust left in Canada's ability to be able to do anything. You put those things together, it becomes very dangerous. But carbon pricing on its own, that's why I say it's a tool. It can be a tool. The real challenge today is, I remember doing a project, 15 years ago for the Premier then of Alberta around carbon capture and sequestration. And the conclusion the study came to then was, in order to really make carbon capture and sequestration needed, you need $150 a ton of CO2. So if you were going to spend money on that, you were throwing good money after bad. And there are some locations where it lends itself. So it is about detail. It is about circumstance. And I think those things have to be taken into account.
Sask Power's Boundary Dam CCS facility is currently capturing and storing emissions at a price of about, or a cost of about $80 a ton. So it's getting there, but it's still an expensive way to do it. Okay, I want to turn to the Pan-Canadian framework. We've got 20 minutes left. I'm going to take
I think there was one other question that we haven't answered.
And I was going to go to questions. But let me just give a little preamble, and then we're going to go to questions.
Sorry. One that's already been asked.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah, there was a question asked of me about how do we balance this? How can I justify taking a position on climate change? How can we have that conversation about the politics of it? And I think there's an important comment to make, and I'll just add a little bit of a build-up, if you forgive me. It'll take me just a minute or two. Climate change is science, hardcore science. What we've been talking about here is about economics. Science and economics, both very important subjects, not perfectly understood. Periods of discovery go on forever, and we keep getting better and better at those things. So it is a matter of profound disappointment to me that the science and economics have taken on some strange political ownership. Why the science of the left wing is different than the science of the right wing, why it's not possible for, certainly within Canada, Conservatives to take a conversation about, hey, it's just a fact. Let's get some facts out on the table. Climate change is almost certainly happening. Exact causes will take us forever to unravel. But definitely a contributor is fossil fuels. Definitely the fact that, not that long ago we had 2 billion people on this planet. We've got 7 billion people on this planet. Now we're going to 10 billion. It makes sense to consume things sensibly. Common sense is not a big part of the conversation that normally goes on this thing. So energy efficiency, the sensible use of what is a finite resource. I mean, my belief is that we will run out of these things in not too distant future, 100, 200 years. So we better use them very, very wisely. So moving into it, so I find it scary, and I find the current politics of it, where, if you want to vote in this side of the politics or that side of the politics, you have to be a believer or not a believer, is complete nonsense. And we shouldn't allow that framing of the debate. And I hope some of those politicians get brave enough to stand up and take some different positions on it.
Okay. Final 15 minutes. So let's talk about, and Ed mentioned the pan-Canadian framework. So I want to talk about both the economics and the politics here. So just to lay the picture, climate policy, or carbon pricing in particular policy, really started in this country at the provincial level. So, BC had a carbon tax in place from 2008. Quebec had a cap and trade system from 2000, and I think the year was 10, 11. Okay. Ontario has introduced in the last few years a cap and trade system that is linked to Quebec and linked to California. Alberta replaced a quasi-pricing regulatory system with a full-out carbon tax in 2016, I suppose. So we currently live in a country where 80% of national income and roughly 80% of our emissions are coming from provinces with a carbon price in place. Now, the election tomorrow may change things. In Ontario, we don't know. We don't know if the future election in Alberta will change things. But currently, it's about 80% of emissions that are, of national emissions that come from provinces with the carbon pricing in place. Manitoba has developed a system that will soon be implemented. Eastern Atlantic Canadian provinces are working away. The feds have now stepped into the picture and said, we actually want a carbon price across the country. We want that carbon price to actually be designed and implemented by each province or territory on their own. We actually prefer the provinces and territories to do their own. And it's got to meet some specs, but only if they don't do it with the federal government step in with what is called the backstop. And the federal government has said, I think mindful of problems created by things like the National Energy Program, that even if we step into your jurisdiction and design a carbon pricing system for you in your jurisdiction, even then, any revenues generated will remain within the jurisdiction. So that is, in a broad outline, where we are today. So my question for the economically minded here is, does that make sense? Does it make sense to, from an economic point of view, to have this kind of provincial, sometimes called a patchwork? And what are the issues that you think about whether this makes sense or not? And politically minded people, does it make sense that this action is starting from the provincial level and the feds are basically encouraging provincial action and only stepping into the gaps if provinces don't act? So, anybody wants to take a shot at that?
Sure, I'll weigh in quickly to get the conversation going.
Oh, actually, let's hear the one question. I guess there's
sure.
one, two people? Okay, let's get those questions and then we'll go for it.
Okay, well, I guess I get to follow up to that. Great question. My question is more about a couple of points that have already been talked about throughout this panel with regards to the pan-Canadian framework. So the first is that we are some of the highest per capita users of energy on the planet. Second is that we have one of the smaller total outputs on the planet, and it's generally kind of staying the same or tapering off based on projections. But the pan-Canadian framework doesn't seem to be hitting the Paris goals. By most reports that are coming out, we're going to miss them just based on the growth of the energy industry. So I'm curious to see why Canada, as the second largest country on the planet with a particularly susceptible environment, is spending its time trying to reduce a fairly small portion of the global carbon budget when we could be instead allocating the money towards resilience efforts to try to maintain the communities that are seeking protection. and particularly in the context of UNDRIP, where we see the right of, well, debatable about what that actually means, but coming through the House of Commons right now, where we see a greater force on the Conservative side and just no development if they don't want it.
So why put our effort at reducing emissions when we could put our effort at adapting to climate change and building resilience? Okay, so we can address whether they are substitutes or complements and whether we can do more than one thing at once. Second question.
So kind of along the same lines as the last question, one of the things that makes tackling climate change so difficult is that the costs associated with conducting this economic activity are paid by people who are not receiving the rents or the benefits of said activity. And that, I think, relates both to the Pan-Canadian framework and to the sort of intergenerational network nature of the problem. Specifically with regards to transportation of these products, how do you think that is involved in that discussion in terms of, if you look at what happened in Alaska or in Lac Mégantic after the accidents there, those communities paid quite large costs but did not necessarily receive much of the benefit of that resource development. How is that playing into the current conversation or lack thereof in terms of transportation of hydrocarbons and the Pan-Canadian framework, and how should that be addressed going forward?
Is that Tim Logan, former McGill student?
And a student of yours, Professor.
Yes, yes. Well, former. You're no longer a student of mine.
Indeed.
Okay, good.
He still may give you an assignment. Heads up.
That was a good question. Excellent. Okay, Paris targets, transportation of these resources. How does it all fit into the Pan-Canadian framework? So we got a bunch there, and we've got 12 minutes to get us over the finish line here. So you can go for one of those two questions, or you can go for the economic and political sensibility of the structure of the Pan-Canadian framework.
Okay. Let me, I'll
we're gonna try to keep this brief.
And I'll keep it brief. First, climate resilience versus mitigation. It's a both and question. That's the unfortunate reality. And just as an aside, I don't buy the argument that Canada's emissions are so small, therefore we get a free pass. I don't think anyone really believes that. Sure, US, China, we get them on board. We cover 40% of emissions. We still have the other 60%. And if Canada can't ask any other country to do something it's not doing on its own. On the question of Pan-Canadian framework and sort of is it economically and politically sensible? So to your question, economically sensible? No. The feds did not prefer originally that each province design its own system. It doesn't make economic sense. You would have one system. But the politics were so difficult that there is no way, and especially with such leadership shown, in Quebec, in Ontario, Alberta, BC, at the subnational level, that the politics just weren't there for the feds to come in with a big regulatory stick and say, hey, this is the only pricing system you're to use. So politically, it was forced, I think, to recognize the different systems. So economically, it isn't the best situation. But again, as I said before, we're all in this together. We get going. We design. That's the most important thing, is just to get everyone on board.
But on the economic imperfection, if those prices were roughly the same across provinces, so right now they're 35 in BC, they're 17 or 18 in Ontario and Quebec. If over time those gaps closed to be either zero or small, would it be all right economically?
Yeah, it's not just the price. You have to think of the ramp. You have to think of allocations. You have to think of stringency. There are a whole bunch of things that with different systems, it becomes enormously complex to design. What I'm saying, it is what it is. Okay. The most important thing is we got going.
Politically, Jean Charest?
Well, and I agree. It's not either or. It's about whether we should just be dealing with adaptation and accept the fact that there will be an increase in CO2 emissions. I think we should, as a country, say that it is in our interest that there be an overall global reduction in CO2 emissions, because the way it affects us as a country. And because that's in our interest, we should do a number of things that demonstrate leadership so that we can attain that objective, and simultaneously address the issue of resilience, because that's reality and it's affecting us now. One thing on the way we structure the discussion politically, It's not because you win an election campaign on an issue that you should assume that there is buy-in to whatever you have campaigned on. And we live in a federal system of government where the provincial participation is not optional. And sometimes in Ottawa, I've been there and I've been on both sides, you get a sense that, you know, we're going to do this come hell or high water. At the end of the day, that's always been a mistake for federal policymakers because the provincial governments need to be on side. And I'm sorry, you have to work at it to get there. I mean, it's not, and it's not a one-size-fit-all. So, but it is it possible to get there? Yes. One thing about the discussion itself, let me share with you what I used to say to my colleagues, because sometimes we'd propose projects and there would be objections to them, and they'd say, well, listen, it's going to cause an impact on the environment. I used to remind them that everything man does on Earth has an impact on the environment. There is no utopia. So let's not mistake or, you know, let ourselves get dragged into this unsensible debate. The real question is, what is it that we should do to mitigate that impact? Because it makes economic sense to do it. And just to be clear, I believe Canada should be selling its hydrocarbons abroad, whether it's oil or gas. And I'll just close with one example. If we collectively in the world had to do one thing, just one thing to reduce CO2 emissions in the world and have the biggest bang for the buck, what is the thing we could do today? Well, the one thing I believe we could do today is sell natural gas to China to replace coal emissions. And yet, but you will find people who object to that. They'll say, no, it's not a good idea. And people who care about CO2 emissions, the one single thing that would reduce drastically CO2 emissions would be that. And why is it that there are people out there who continue to say, no, don't do that. Don't do it. It's not good. It doesn't make sense to me. And so I think we can get to that place where there are good policies, but it's going to require a bigger effort than what a better and more consistent effort for the next few years.
Thank you. Jen.
Okay. So it is less than ideal that the different provinces have different carbon pricing systems, but it's also less than ideal that we don't have free trade in beer, for example. So there are a lot of things that are less than ideal about Canada. With each province having its own system, there's a lot of flexibility there, which is probably a good thing. Work by the Ecofiscal Commission has suggested that the cost to Canada of each province doing its own thing rather than just a flat carbon tax across the country suggests that the total impact on the Canadian economy is not that big. What is, I think, a bigger concern for me with the different pricing systems is this issue of fairness going forward if the prices continue to be fairly divergent, especially with the cap and trade system versus the carbon tax system. And I think that is going to be a bigger issue going forward, and that's going to be very political.
Steve, to what extent do you worry about the pan-Canadian structure? Most of your operations, I think, are in one jurisdiction.
Yeah, I mean, we do have operations across Canada. So from off the East Coast, we have operations in Quebec, in Ontario. It does make life more complicated. Would have much preferred a simple system because then it's easy to execute and you make more money in a sense, and then you've got more to distribute. But you know, like most journeys, we start from here. We have an imperfect country, but it's better than most. You know, so you know, the idea of an overarching framework, the idea of provinces, and actually nearer you get to the point of real decision making, having an impact has some appeal because context is everything. You know, the challenges for Quebec, very different than the challenges of Alberta, very different than the challenges of BC, and therefore having some ability to adjust those to make them more acceptable, to make some progress on the thing. But so less than perfect, but understand, and I think we could work with it. You know, we operate globally as well, so we see these cycles globally, and it's very interesting how Others who led this debate are in a very different position in Europe now, very different position in the UK now, as they're realizing the consequence of destroying industry and income and the quality of living of people in the country. I think for the first time in my lifetime, we've made progress. We've seen some stuff internationally. It's not perfect. We've seen some stuff nationally. It's not perfect. We've seen some stuff provincially. It's not perfect, but it is progress. So, there is some comfort in the fact we've been moving.
I think we're going to wrap this up. I don't know about you, but I would desperately like a cup of coffee.
We've been that entertaining, I see.
We are. Well, I didn't really get my first one this morning. So I want to thank you all. I hope that you found that this was informative, and I hope that you found that maybe there were some parts of pricing and striking that balance between the economy and the environment and carbon pricing, that you understood there's some more complexity perhaps than you thought 2 hours ago. I want to thank Jen and Ed for being part of this panel. Thank you very much. And I think it's not the first time you've been on one of our events, and I hope it's not the last. Jean Charest and Steve Williams, I want to thank you for being on these panels, but I also want to thank both of you for being advisors. You have both been outstanding advisors on the Ecofiscal Commission, wonderful ambassadors. And I will add that Suncor is one of, I think we have 10 funders of Ecofiscal, so I want to thank you for your support and generosity. So thank you all very much.